Good evening. I'm Alan Jones. I was going to say I'm not from London, I'm from Northern Ireland, and I am also the president of the Royal Institute of British Architects, and I welcome you all to 66 Portland Place, our London home. Thank you for joining us tonight for our 2020 Royal Gold Medal lecture by Grafton Architects with co-founders Shelley McNamara and Yvonne Farrell. As president and chair of the 2020 Royal Gold Medal jury, I wish to take a few moments to reflect on why we are here. The world we live and practice within is complex, with numerous interconnected ideas and issues, opportunities and problems that challenge us as individuals and as practices and as organisations. To me, the RIBA, like similar institutes across the world, is a rock, a piece of firm, solid ground providing solace, support, and intellectual sustenance to help us, architects and future architects, to see further and clearer, be inspired, and be better prepared to engage with the sometimes bright and sometimes more cloudy and foggy and boggy landscape we find ourselves in day to day. It is through collective fellowship of a profession and membership of institutes such as the RIBA, of us appreciating our differences, how we complement and are different to each other, but being better together. As a team of individuals, we can go further and realise greater positive impact and contributions to our world. We are all better together. In the same way, we need institutes to give us firm, solid ground in a landscape that is increasingly demanding and changing so quickly. We also need beacons, brightly shining examples of how to behave professionally, ethically, and humanely, and how to make the world a better place. So for so many reasons, Grafton Architects receiving the 2020 Royal Gold Medal is so timely and so appropriate. I'm going to give you a quick insight into the interconnectedness of what I have just talked about. I have checked with Grafton Architects that they don't mind me telling you this story. After coming to the decision on the Royal Gold Medal for 2020, I didn't realise that the president has to phone the potential recipient to check, because there has historically been one instance of it being declined, and Her Majesty, or the King at the time, wasn't pleased, so we had to check. I was sitting in Randalstown, County Antrim, and I had to phone Dublin. And I phoned and said, would it be possible to speak to the two co-founders? And luckily, they happened to be in. And I said, I will phone back in 5 minutes. Could you please organise them to be in a room, then I can have a private conversation with them, please? So I phoned back. And I had a conversation where I said, I have to ask this question. It might seem a bit odd, but I need to have an answer today. If you were offered the Royal Gold Medal for 2020, would you accept it? And the answer that came back, and I'm not sure from which or who, I should say, was, oh, Alan, if you only knew what we have been doing this morning. We've been working on drainage. And when you get questions like this, it makes working on drainage seem worthwhile. And I said, back to the question, would you accept if you were offered it? And I said, I can't see what's happening, I'm on the phone, but I guess you're looking at each other, what's the answer? And the answer came, we would be very glad to accept. Tonight's event is a complete sellout. We could have sold the tickets twice over or even more, and we are very excited to be live streaming and the lecture on RIBA's YouTube channel. So hello to everybody who's watching online. I understand we have a number of schools of architecture watching live tonight, so a warm welcome to you all and to everyone else watching out there. Thank you for joining us. I would also like to take the opportunity to thank ARPA tonight, who are the sponsors of the Royal Gold Medal 2020 programme. I have a few points of housekeeping. You're welcome to keep your mobile phones on, but please turn them to silent or vibrate. There isn't a fire alarm test planned, so if you hear the alarm, it's the real thing, and the exits can be found at the front and the back of the hall. If you are a social media user, please feel free to tweet and Insta post. The hashtag for the event is #Royal Gold Medal. I would now like to welcome to the stage one of this year's Royal Gold Medal nominators to introduce the work of Grafton Architects and the co-founders Yvonne and Shelley. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage the Professor of Architecture at University College Dublin, Professor Hugh Campbell.
Thank you very much. I was happily planning to be in the audience this evening, but then I suppose honoured and humbled to be asked by Shelley and Yvonne to make this short introduction. But also very daunted, of course, how in front of such an esteemed audience to encapsulate all of their achievements, to talk about the particular nature of their contribution to architecture in the few minutes allotted. So at a certain point I settled on the idea of maybe using music and images instead of words. And at this point, because of the vagaries of music licensing, which I learnt about an hour ago, I have to say that we're going to pause the live stream while we listen to some music here in the hall. So to those people who are watching on live stream, don't panic, don't adjust your sets, and we'll see you in about 1 minute and 15 seconds on the other side. Stream can begin again. Count to 3, start again. So what I've been looking at is the magnificent building, which I suppose we could say marked Grafton Architects' arrival on the world stage, although I think it's also fair to say they had been arriving for a long time. This is the Bocconi University building in Milan, which won the inaugural World Building of the Year award back in 2008. And the music you will recognize, no doubt, as the Prisoner's Chorus from Beethoven's opera Fidelio. And when I wrote about this building at the invitation of Shelley and Yvonne, around about the time of its opening, this was one of 2 pieces of music on which I fixated as being somehow emblematic of the building. This chorus marks the moment in the opera when the prisoners are freed. Oh, what a joy, they sing, to breathe freely again in the open air. And in a production that I saw a long time ago, the prisoners emerge into the light as a great closed slab is lifted. This feeling of a weight lifted and of freedom created in the space thus uncovered, which was in the music, was also most evidently in the building. Literally, of course, in the heroic gesture of the cantilevering of the aula to hover above the concourse below, and also in a more general sense that architecture could operate through the manipulation and the remission of gravity and of mass in order to free space, a theme which was already nascent in Grafton's work, even in their domestic and smaller scale projects, but also in a number of motorway bridges that they were designing at the time. But I think equally important was this idea that a piece of architecture might exert a strong emotional and communicative charge equivalent to that of music. It could make you feel something. And on the opening day, with a great crowd gathering in that concourse, this was already evident. 10 years on, another Italian city, more great crowds, more free space, now conflated into a single, freshly coined word translated into myriad languages, the theme for the Venice Biennale, which Shelley and Yvonne had curated that year. As many people commented, it seemed as much an act of architecture, in fact, as an act of curation, the achievement being in the releasing of the Biennale's venues back to their best selves, to walk the, for once, unobstructed length of the corderie, or through the, for once, navigable rooms of the central pavilion, all for once in daylight, was to feel the theme of the show and the imperative that drives their own work, free space. Oh, what a joy to breathe freely again in the open air. 10 years on, and Shelley and Yvonne are busy in several cities, including this one, making places characterized by that same generous impulse, by structure freeing space, liberating it for use. Look, for instance, at the striking new geography, as they call it, that they conjured for the Technical University in Lima, Peru, which won, of course, the RIBA International Prize in 2016. Look at the new gathering place they are making for the LSE in Lincoln's Inn Fields, or the new university building they have just completed in Kingston. Look at the civic spaces they are promising us for the new Dublin City Library on Parnell Square. There is something extraordinarily potent and direct about these projects. It is not, I need not tell this audience, it's not at all easy to find such a direct line between the distilled intention of an early sketch and the charged presence of a finished building. This ability, this uncanny ability, has a lot to do, I think, with the successive teams that they have built around them. And of course, this award is going to the whole team. It has a lot to do with their long immersion in, commitment to, and continuing passion for the culture and the discipline of architecture, as evidenced in their practice, but also in their teaching, in a manner that is actually relatively rare among the winners of this medal. They've always combined teaching with practice, seeing them as mutually reinforcing. And even as projects have grown in scale and prestige and the portfolio has expanded, they've continued to teach for a long time in UCD, in Yale, in Harvard, and latterly in Mendrisio. I've had the privilege of both being taught by them and teaching alongside them as colleagues. In Grafton's vivid communicative architecture, we find a kind of orchestrated concordance between buildings and people. In the late 19th century, Heinrich Wülflin talked about something similar when he proposed that forms, he said, become meaningful to us only because we recognize in them the expression of a sentient soul. Instinctively, we animate each object. We read our own image in all phenomena. We expect everything to possess what we know to be the conditions of our own well-being. And this idea, which came to be coined as empathy, is best thought of as a kind of rhyme between buildings and bodies, between spaces and feelings, all part of a conversation that is all going on between our architecture and ourselves. And I think ultimately it is this sense of empathy that characterises Grafton's work. Their buildings might be considered as acts of fellow feeling. But I think empathy also defines Shelley and Yvonne in the way that they engage with colleagues, with clients, with students, with the public. Over the course of the Biennale and since, I have seen them become ever more eloquent and urgent advocates for architecture, for the role that a concerted and considered creativity might play in improving lives and in addressing some of the fundamental challenges of our time. But in closing, I just want to note that where they're heading is always bound up with where they started 40 years ago. This is when Grafton Architects first came into being as a collective then of 5 in a space above Weir's Jewellers on Grafton Street, before it was pedestrianised, as in this image. And the fact that they located here, and that they were named not for the principles, but for the street, established what Shelley has recently called an ethos that has endured. To be in the city, in the swim of things, open to possibilities, that was always the plan. Oh, what a joy to breathe freely again in the open air. In her great novel of urban life, Jazz, the late Toni Morrison noted of her characters that in the city they are not so much new as themselves, they're stronger, riskier selves. That's Shelley and Yvonne, stronger and riskier at the outset, stronger and riskier still. That, as a serendipitous street sign that told me on the way here, that is the Grafton way. I think it's time that they begun. So please join me in welcoming Shelley McNamara and Yvonne Farrell of Grafton Architects.
I'd just like to say to both Alan and Hugh, everything was all right until you saw the hairstyles. So we begin the serious matter of the lecture. It is a really great honour to stand here, and it's with great pleasure that this evening we are giving the 2020 RIBA Royal Gold Medal lecture. I begin telling you about a recent radio advertisement for a music program. The musician was describing how he asked older, experienced traditional musicians for advice on how he should play certain pieces. The answers he got, there were 2. Do you know the way the wind blows through cornfields? Well, that's how you play it. Or 2, do you know how water sounds as it falls over a waterfall? Well, that's how you play it. That's the way we want to describe imagination as the central strength of architecture. The responsibility is the ethical anchor of this amazing profession. Social responsibility, the impact of what we do, how we participate, how we collude, how we make. The questions really arise of what extra ingredient can we imagine that functions, that enriches the lives of others, that helps the earth retain its beauty. The first slide we begin this evening is a bowl, a functional object, held by the ceramic that provides the enclosure. It is the space within that holds the liquid. It reminds us of what Alejandro de la Sota says, that architects should make as much nothing as possible, because it's in the nothing that people stand. It is by chosen materials that space is enclosed. There's a Japanese word called chintsuji, and the Japanese, it is an art of repairing broken pottery by mending the areas of breakage with lacquer mixed with powdered gold. As a philosophy, it treats breakage and repair as part of the history of the object, rather than something to disguise and hide or pretend that it didn't happen. We use this metaphor with you this evening of how architecture adds to the layer of building on this earth. How, at this time of climate change, a time to care deeply about our world, that we repair the broken, that we reuse where possible, that we become hyper-conscious of our use of materials, that everything we build matters. We're receiving the gold medal, so we want to talk about gold as a precious material. This little gold boat is in the National Museum in Dublin. It's a crafted piece of beaten gold. It measures 184 millimeters long. If it were to scale, it would be a vessel 15 meters long. It contains benches, rowlocks, 2 rows of 9 oars, and a paddle rudder for steering. After 2,500 years, it is still astonishingly beautiful. On the right-hand side, the gold for the Incas, it was a sacred metal, believed by them to have been given to humans by the sun god. Some say that it was the tinkling sound of this light metal that made it a very special thing for the Incas, not its surface, but its ability to tinkle. We would maintain with you this evening that the light from the sun is a type of gold dust, and it is a free resource. As a profession, we take and modify materials. We transform raw materials into surfaces that contain space that holds us. On the left-hand side is the Doge's Palace in Venice. I took this photograph, I think in 2016, and I couldn't understand it at first. There were 2 types of light falling on the terrazzo floor. It turns out that one is the light of the sky and the other is sunlight. I'd never seen them both happen simultaneously and separately. On the other side of the slide is Jorn Utsen's seat at his doorway to Can Lys, his wonderful house in Mallorca. It transforms cold materials of concrete and ceramic tile into the sensation of silk and comfort because Utsen had the ability to judge the needs and dimensions of the human body. Here are 9 projects of our office, all to the same scale. Housing, civic centre, schools, Bocconi University. This drawing was done for an exhibition in Belfast, which took place 15 years after Group 91. It was 2006. And it's important to state for us that plans are the logic of an organization, and the section has the emotional component. So as Hugh, Professor, has said, that after years of building in Ireland, Bocconi became our first international competition and our first opportunity to build outside the island of Ireland. This diagram does begin, if you like, the idea of this competition, 1,000 offices held in the sky, but also held apart to bring light from the sky down to the lower levels, and in terms of basement, the carving of the ground in order to corrupt the ground and bring light from above. These drawings are describing the position in the city of Milan, a busy street, a quieter street, an entry, the folded ground, the carving, the pushing and pulling of space, and on the right-hand side, the model which describes the structure every 25 meters, a double structure of 3.5 meters wide, which held the structure and held the courtyards. And what was important that just before this project, we had finished this small project behind Merrion Square in Denzil Lane in Dublin. And what's significant is that the north facade was facing not a great elevation, and we developed this abstract composition of glass, 3 types of glass: clear glass, white glass, and glass planks. And when we were building Bocconi, it was a way of thinking of these glass layers that allowed the professors to have privacy, to have light within the courtyard of the roof structure. The other issue which was really important is that when Bocconi University asked us what stone would we like to use with this project, with the vast choice of wonderful stones that come from that amazing country of Italy, we chose Ceppo. And Ceppo is this beautiful, ordinary, what we call geological concrete, which was in the mountains close by. And on the right-hand side is this amazing photograph of the quarry. Sorry, I just go back. Of the quarry, where when we arrived to see this quarry in northern Italy, it was like a one-to-one model of the sloping surface of Bocconi itself. These are the mines where Ceppo, they mine it, they carve out 9 meters by 9 meters by 9 meters, they carve into the mountain and take the stone. And the point making this evening that as architects, when we specify something, we're actually taking from the earth's surface in order to make the building. And as Hugh has described, not only are we making this aula for 1,000 people, but we're also looking for natural light to enter. These periscopes which feed up into the upper sections, here is the drawing bringing the golden light of the sun, of natural daylight, into this incredibly large room. And here we have Anna Ryan, one of our architects, illegally playing cello up on this piece of geology when we were at the opening of the building. And looking at the image that Hugh has also used, it was also about the material of glass. Glass is the amazing material of intensely heated sand, 8 meters high of clear glass, the city of Milan flowing into this space, Bianca Lazza, this beautiful white marble which became the interior stone that cascades 5 meters and 9 meters below. In 2002, we entered, maybe later, I've lost track of dates, we entered a competition in Lima in Peru. And what's amazing about Lima is that there are a number of desert cities in the world. On the Pacific coast, a huge city with 40-meter high cliffs onto the Pacific, with signs that say, in case of glass bottles, somebody's been drinking early. 40-meter high cliffs onto the Pacific, and you think that if you're 12 degrees down from the equator, that it should be an unbelievably hot city. But because of the von Humboldt current, which comes up from Antarctica, it keeps the cities at a temperature in the 20s Celsius, and also creates this amazing fog which dematerializes the city and also refracts light. And what's amazing about being an architect is that when you are researching cities in which you're building, that you come across these incredible people. And this drawing, which is called Naturgemälde, which is a really important drawing by a man called Alexander von Humboldt, who was the person after whom the current is named. The current existed before him, but his name is attributed to him. And I'd like to refer you to a wonderful book by Andrea Wolf, and it's called The Invention of Nature, The Adventures of Alexander von Humboldt, the Lost Hero of Science. And this man was a really good friend of Goethe. He was a friend of Thomas Jefferson. He influenced Darwin. I mean, when Darwin was setting off on the HMS Beagle in 1831 at the age of 22, he was only allowed to bring a few books. And guess what? On his little shelf, the 7 of the books were von Humboldt's account of his Latin American expedition. But the reason for showing you this drawing here tonight is von Humboldt had a holistic approach, a scientific method of including art, history, poetry, and politics alongside data. His concept of nature was of a global force. One of von Humboldt's achievements was to make science accessible and popular. His concept of nature was one of global patterns underpinning our current thinking. And what's really wonderful about this section is the first time that a drawing was made that held the scientific data. Here we have plant names, place, heights, atmospheric pressure, species, and he puts it together to make this beautiful drawing describing the planet on which we live. These two images, we've told this story before, that when we were presenting a project as part of the Venice Biennale of 2012, it was under common ground, we had these two images, and the workmen in Venice asked, why have you two images of the same thing? And for us, what is really interesting is on the left-hand side, you have the Machu Picchu from the 15th century, and you have on the right-hand side Skellig Michel, which is on the, like St. Michael's Mount or Mont Saint-Michel in France, that these were hermits building on these unbelievable places. So this is between the 8th and the 10th century, perhaps, in the Atlantic. So you've got the intimate and the major Atlantic to one side, and you have the intimate and the Andes on the other. And these three images, which we like to show to you on the left-hand side, is when we got to know the city of Lima. Lima has these incredible structures which are called Oaxaca, and these are made of adobe and clay. And they are pre-Incan, indigenous coastal civilizations, about between 200 and 700 AD. But what's amazing about these is that when you look at them closely, you can actually see the handprints of people who have made these individual bricks, and then these bricks are put together to make these really administrative and ceremonial platforms in the city of, which is now Lima. In the middle is this incredible image from Machu Picchu, and as a friend, an architect friend who described when she visited Machu Picchu that the Incas had the ability to transform stone into cushions. When you look at the detail of how these are carved, not only are they beautifully carved in these dimensions which we can see, but also in underneath are these sockets because they're in seismic areas, so these are interlocked and held absolutely beautifully. And on the extreme right, over beside Shelley, are these beautiful terraces, these man-made terraces. And it's hard to see, that's the size of a human being in there. They're not these little terraces on which we might do a gardening world kind of description of what is grown there. But they have, if you like, modified the mountains for the use of themselves. When we were doing this competition, there were a number of things in our mind. One is this sketch of the Pacific, the 40-meter high cliffs, the valley in which the building was to be built, this, if you like, this 360-meter long site where like a boomerang shape, and the brief which was for big laboratories. It's a new university, smaller laboratories, libraries and smaller classrooms, which we used as a cascade. And here's the busy motorway on this side. Parallel to all of this is a developing love within our office for the fantastic work of South American architects, where they make these incredible structures that free space and make social space. And this is by Méndez de Rocha. It's a stadium, a soccer stadium, Dorado, and the soccer is off screen. The sport is obviously the focus of this building, but for us, what was really interesting was the social possibilities within the undercroft of the great structure. So this drawing on the top is really from the competition, really dealing with the seismic issue of Lima, which is very seismic, the bigger rooms on the lower level, and the roofs of the functions becoming these gardens for student work. But in terms of the architectural idea of education, it was really that you mix, that the decision within our understanding of this climate, that if the climate is so benign, architecturally, what could be outside most of the time and what really has to be inside. So part of our analysis was to look at the brief and say what rooms do need to be inside and what else could be exterior. So all the circulation is exterior. Many things happen on the outside. So this is really questioning, could a university be an arena for learning? Could it be a man-made cliff? So this paper model is describing the busy motorway on this side and the cascading structure to a residential area here. And this is the building sitting in the busy motorway, shading from the very hot sun, acting like a stadium for learning. So these are the building in context. In terms of the seismic situation, the lower part of the building is embedded in the earth. These are the seismic isolators, which are the big springs on which the rest of the building sits. So these are 1.5 meter wide springs on which the rest of the building sits, and this peak cap is protecting from the sun. And in here we have a circulation system which allows the students of various disciplines to see into the various laboratories. And in terms of other architectural ideas that we've used in universities, it's about overlap and about learning from one another. And for us, as Hugh has described in terms of this interwoven landscape, here are the sections which move and change as we move down through the plan. And what's really interesting for us is that by virtue of the shape of the site, instead of having clear vistas, like in a medieval city situation, each of the vistas is slightly changed because the structure is shifting to do with the curve. So you know something is happening and you're brought through in terms of each of the 20 meter shifts in the structure. I'd like to show you this image this evening because it's, I suppose, very important for us to describe. Hugh referred to it. We do make a case, I'll just read you a little bit here, that our conviction that architecture is now the new geography developed through a body of work and reflection on what is happening in the world around us. As more and more of the natural world disappears, what we do as architects actually makes the world we live in at a scale where it's possible to consider it as geography, not as individual objects, whether beautiful or not, but by the sheer amount of building. Architecture now is at the scale of the Earth's geography. It is modified Earth. And the image that is up here is one from I'll just check the date here, it's from 1993, probably with those hairdos that you saw earlier on. But what is really interesting is that this project was for a competition for the Cliffs of Moher on the west coast of Ireland. And the project was a turning point in our work because it was the first time that we thought about a building as a piece of landscape. And it was the first time that we used collage as a shorthand for dealing with materials and dealing with organization and making the project about character and texture. That this was done with scalpel and scissors and glue, but the presentation panels were tactile then in themselves. And rather than it being a series of line drawings, the collage became our study. The skin of the building, which was influenced by the beautiful stones in that area around this cliff. And so the project was conceived as a ruin with great slabs of Liscannor slab. So this term, architecture as new geography, became a really important issue for us. And as we move on, this is our own city, Dublin, not far from here. But this image describes Georgian Dublin in a cliff-like streetscape with its own secret gardens. And this image shows these brick cliffs of Dublin because we want to describe how the Georgians manufactured and incorporated landscape into building of their gardens, of building of the city. And the enclosing walls are making a geography of walls. So like the Japanese gold repair, the kintsugi, my Japanese isn't very good this evening, these next two projects are about repair. So both projects I'll talk about for a little while here are a result of competitions, and both were won with another architectural practice. The Electricity Supply Board headquarters is with O'Mahony Pike Architects, and the Dublin City Library is with Shaftesbury Architects. But this image also describes research that we were doing into Georgian streetscapes. And what's amazing is that between 50 and 70% of these walls are solid. And the tall windows and the deep reveals bring light into the spaces. And for the ESB, for the Electricity Supply Board headquarters, on the right-hand side, you see the 120 metres of Dublin, just down from Merrion Square. This is allegedly one of the longest Georgian streets in the world. So this is a really important location in the city. And we were weaving the geography of space into this plan, into this streetscape. And the paper model describes the retention and the remaking of the street, like the Japanese bowl that we are remaking. There were 16 houses which were obliterated in the 1960s, and we felt that the rhythm of this Georgian 7.5 meters, this doorway, this metal, was the rhythm that is familiar within the Georgian. So we reinstated the street, we carved these courtyards, we make narrow fingers of office space which allow light from the east, and we make a new streetscape. And here is the study section where we're carving, using the, if you like, the manipulation of Georgian with the streetscape carved, the light coming from east and west. What is really important for us in terms of the new geography is that landscape then becomes the gift to the citizen. Here is the wall to the city. It's permeated by a public route, so the block itself, the block has a route. Instead of it being a private zone, this public route will be open during the day, and carved into the earth are these gardens. So this is a long section showing you the narrow, sustainable depth of the office buildings, the light carving down into these spaces, and sometimes these gardens are doubled. So 15 meters, 15 meters, 15 meters, 15 meters. This rhythm is, if you like, claimed again for this street within Dublin. This project this is for Parnell Square. It's a cultural quarter in our beloved city. This is Parnell Square, and what's really wonderful about its history is that these buildings that were this was a pleasure park. Here is the Lord Charlemont's house, which is now Hugh Lane Gallery, forming this beautiful the northern edge, the highest point of this part of the square. But what was really wonderful is that these spaces were built at the same time. The hospital was for maternity hospital, and they needed funding. So not only was it a hospital, but also the pleasure gardens was where the money from people who had it could be enticed from them, because they were enjoying these pleasure gardens, and it also kept the hospital going. What's really important for us in this project is that it is reuse, it is restitching, it is putting the gold if you like, dust back into this area. It needs regeneration. The site is these houses, this terrace of houses here, and the interior of the block is where the library will also be. So it's a reuse of the existing buildings and the reuse of the space behind. And our section, which is really transforming, the upper is the idea that you would have a carved space in which the zenithal light is brought into the main library space, and that pleasure gardens would be to the roof, and that you would enjoy the rest of the view of the city. And our section then is the changing the public realm in the existing space, modifying the existing rooms so that these beautiful Georgian rooms are used again, getting south light. You move through into this space here where you get fantastic zenithal light. You move up through here to roof gardens, and at this point you view back down over the city of Dublin. And this patchwork of uses, this coloured plan is really to explain to you the variety of uses that these working with librarians to make this, if you like, free space within the city of Dublin, which will change the character of that area, which will bring life to this area. And librarians, we've discovered, not only in this project but in others, are incredibly at the coalface of society and are really quite radical as people. So you're moving in the space, you've come in through the Georgian face, you see the Georgian building, that facade forming part of this new space with the zenithal light, and as you move up through the building, these gardens are embedded and bringing you to the upper space. In terms of going back in time as well, this is an image from 1995. It was what we called, it was a competition in La Villette in Paris, and it was an eco house. For us, it was the design of it was called the abandoned snail shell. So over here you get this a study of how nautilus, the fantastic snails who have this capacity to move within oceans that can retract and live independently and rise and move. This was really saying, could we make a core where it was self-sufficient? So this was our study of a black surface which was basalt, which was getting heat, which was heated through glazing, and would be a self-sufficient house. And around the same time, we were building in Trinity College. And this collage, following on from the Cliffs of Moher, with basalt lava, with granite on the base. And in terms of the earth as client, the master plan was to just have a base, a full base, and to obliterate these two mature lime trees. And we, in working with Trinity College, really felt that the two lime trees were, as living creatures, were just as much part of the Trinity campus as buildings. So we held these two creatures as part of our architecture. Just coming to the if you like, the description of this here, we crafted the content of the Venice Biennale, which Hugh Campbell referred to, and we invited participants from around the world, and we included some specific work that dealt with the issue of the Earth's resources and the impact of climate change. And we had two films, which people can get at their own leisure on their iPhone and enjoy them. One was called Il Capo, and this was about mining of Carrara marble. And it's really important to remember that each year, millions of tons of Carrara are mined. And the film shows the process of extracting this beautiful white stone from where it has lain as part of the Earth's crust for millions of years. And the other film that we twinned with that was called Chasing Ice. It was a 2012 documentary about the efforts of the nature photographer James Balog. And he shows the effect of climate change on glaciers melting in Greenland. And in the Biennale, we positioned two projects side by side. One was by Dorte Mandruff. It was an ice fiord centre in Greenland. And her project deals with the extreme challenges in terms of climate. Historically, the significance of her location was that the Inuit people and the European Norse met there, and that was kind of social interaction within the superpower of nature. But Mandruff, it's really sad that she observes that the permafrost is melting. And as you move through in the exhibition, through the Dorte Mandruff snow in the exhibition, you arrived in Marina Tabassum's mud-floored vernacular Bangladeshi village courtyard, where she's working with communities whose monthly incomes are less than $100. Bangladesh has a population of 165 million. Most of Bangladesh is less than 10 meters above sea level, with most of the coastal south being generally at sea level. The 80% of Bangladesh is floodplain, and you can imagine what that means in terms of global warming. My last image before Shelley speaks is to describe, as Hugh Campbell described, that we teach in the Academia in Mendrisio. And this year we based our student research on the Venetian lagoon. And the drawing on the right-hand side shows the dark blue is really the three 15-meter cuts where the big ships come in through the lagoon wall into the very shallow Sweetwater lagoon. And the idea of our teaching was to focus on creative responses to challenges of making architecture in sustainable, inventive ways in challenging locations. We chose the Venetian lagoon as the area for research because of global warming and the relationship to the sea that requires special responses. Students were asked to develop strategies of design for a self-sufficient house. This is the first phase. We're moving into housing now. But we wanted them to respond directly to the dilemmas of contemporary and future architecture. So we asked them to focus on water, on wood, and on glass, and on the extreme left is a beautiful 1 to 20 model by one of our students, where she's formed a kind of a DNA of the private world of the house and the public route of bird watchers, so that the two could work together. And I'd like you to look at the center part of the image, because we began this project in September of last year. And part of the student work was to deal with the expected tide heights. So this was on their drawing, this is an actual door. So you're looking at a door handle at a normal height. And this was the expected high watermark. And if you go back into your iPhones and you look at what happened, that you know that every year there's a thing called acqua alta, where in the Italian word for high water, words for high water, if people remember last November, Venice was hit by a combination of storm weather, lunar and tidal conditions that rose the water to a height of 1.8. So you get, that's a door handle, that was the high tide, and what is happening. So just to conclude my part of it, as part of Free Space in Venice, we held public discussions once a month. The last one was entitled The Earth as Client. And one of the speakers that we invited was Mary Robinson, who had been President of Ireland in 1990 to 97. She was the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights in 1997 to 2002, and she set up what is called climate justice. When Mary Robinson came to Venice, to the Biennale, she visited the exhibition, and she was so taken by the world of architecture that she tore up her prepared speech and described architecture as the narrative of hope, with amazing possibilities to invent a possible future. Thank you. We were supposed to move seamlessly across the stage.
We were supposed to move a bit more quickly as well. Yvonne has done this before. It's one of the disadvantages of following her. Half of 60 is 30. And I now have 18 minutes. So I'll do my best, because this thing goes red at a certain moment, I'm told. Alan mentioned in his introduction that when he phoned us, he said that there was somebody who refused the gold medal. And I'm afraid we went to look and see who that might be. And since Alan didn't tell you, we're not going to tell you either. And it was actually our lawyer who discovered it, because I couldn't find it. But when we were looking at the legacy of the Royal Gold Medal, we discovered this fantastic image, which is the second person, an Italian, to receive the Royal Gold Medal, an archaeologist and an architect who excavated the Appian Way. And we were intrigued by this idea of a wall of fragments, because we talk a lot within our office about fragments. And one of the components of the Free Space manifesto, let's say, but also one of the components in our own search for ways of making work, is a discussion about fragments, in the sense that architecture is the framework for life, and in order for us to make new frameworks, we have to find ways of translating the sensory experience of life into architecture. And that series of sensory experiences is built through fragments over time. But we're also interested in it as an idea about history, because it's something that we talk about a lot again in our work, that history is not linear. Time is not linear, and certainly not in architecture. And the older we get, the more we reach back into time. And there's something very important about that. And it's also that we don't see the difference between the past and the future. And Jung has a beautiful term where he talks about the unconscious psyche, and that it's not only immensely old, that it's capable of growing into an equally remote future. So that's one of the kind of wonderful phenomena of architecture, is this thing of time and past, present, and future being, let's say, one thing. The other thing that's interesting about this wall of fragments is that it perhaps raises the dilemma which the Canadian pianist Glenn Gould speaks about in relation to the work of Beethoven. And I was just saying to Hugh that I was going to refer to Beethoven yet again. But Glenn Gould talks about the struggle between the inventor and the curator, that we look after the legacy that we have inherited, but there's also the need to invent. But what he says is particularly interesting from our point of view is that this struggle between the inventor and the creator is the very surface of Beethoven's music, that he doesn't try to hide the struggle. So there is a struggle in architecture in finding that balance between the minder or the profession that tends to history, to our inheritance, and the need or wish or urge to invent. In relation to, I'm going to show 4 projects, 3 of which finished in the same month, in 2019, and one of which is rising as we speak in London. This first one is a new university on a plateau, a windy plateau in Paris-Saclay outside of Paris. And it's an enormous new campus which is planned to happen over, I think, 50 years. And when we went to visit this site, we found ourselves literally on an open site, which was a kind of feeling of agoraphobia, in a sense, having worked in dense urban situations. And so our urge was, both because it was windy and cold on the day we visited, was to make a microclimate, to make an enclosure which would establish its own energy in this new campus. And one of the references we used was the wonderful mosque in Cordoba, where it compresses the new building into half of the site, and there's the release of the garden for the other half of the site. Now, this happened for completely different reasons, so I'm describing it in the way that we interpreted it, as opposed to the whole history of this incredible building, which would take an evening to discuss. But what we found was important was this challenge of how do you make a new university in an open plateau in a new campus. And the reference that we used was the reference of the monastery, that it could be a 21st century monastery. Yvonne talked about the arena for learning, the vertical University of Lima, and I suppose the building in Milan, which is like a kind of a city in miniature, really. And we were looking, in this case, we were looking at Bastide towns, a love we've inherited from our early teachers in Dublin, especially Edward Jones, who I still remember speaking about the diagonal relationship between the religious and the commercial space. And what's really interesting when you go back to look at this is how you can have an orthogonal grid, and by placing 2 elements in this chessboard relationship, that you can set up a sense of dynamic and movement. We were looking at scale and measure. One of the really important things is how do you get the measure of a project? How do you know when it's too big or too small? How do you judge that? And this is our project at the same scale as Trinity College in Dublin. And we were heartened and encouraged to discover that we could walk this every day and check it and see what it would feel like. Ospedale Maggiore in Milan, which was a huge inspiration and help to us when we were doing Bocconi, simply because it gave us the courage to think about making a long wall. And Palais Royal, which of course is at another scale altogether. But what's wonderful is that it can contain space with this thin perimeter of surface and make a new world within that wall. So these are the sketches about compressing and releasing in order to make a sense of togetherness, I suppose, because there was a question, how would we bring students together in this low density, relatively low rise project from our point of view. We were given a maximum height. Xavier de Gator was the master planner. We were given a 1.35 meter grid. Everything had to work on that grid, everything. The paving slabs, the structure, the rhythm of the walls. And we were asked to plant 100 trees, which was a wonderful proposition. What we found was that Ospedale Maggiore really taught us that if we put all the collective spaces in the middle and release this perimeter to be where the professors and the administrators and maybe secondary teaching spaces would happen, that we could make a center of gravity, that we could make a focus, that this was the world of the students where the students come together, and that we could make a finger of space which would connect that central focus to the garden and bridging over this archway that we would make the library, which was the gateway from the entrance courtyard to the garden. The length of the building, the 200 meters, we used to the 1.35 grid to set up the rhythm of the facade. It sets up the rhythm of the window, the double window, the treble window. It goes from 1.35 to 2.7 to 5.4 to 10.8. And this really again, we found that looking at older projects of Libera and Turagni and the rationalist work and how they have no fear of using repetition and how repetition and rhythm is so central to architecture. But you probably feel the tension that Glenn Gould talks about on the surface of this facade, because we were also trying to break through the relentless rhythm. And one of the ways we did this was to make a very thin screen where the south light comes on to the north-facing facade. So we have the compressed building, the central space, this finger of space which reaches out to the library and connects to the garden and makes this new institution. Something we were really become obsessed with is this thing of light and shade and how that sets the stage, let's say, the tone of how people respond to the surface or the wall of a building. And that was a real wish that we would bring south light onto a north-facing street. This is the color of the earth, so the tone of the building relates to this color. And this is the Chelida sculpture, which we love because Chelida seems to trap the light inside the solid. And that's something we love to think about, that you might be walking outside and look into a building and it traps the sunlight within its solidity. Edith Sitwell says a wonderful thing about poetry. She says that rhythm is one of the principal translators between dream and reality in poetry. And these kinds of comments, again, really inform and encourage and inspire us in the making of architecture, that other disciplines have these same words and structures and I suppose, again, struggles in terms of whether it's poetry or music that architects have. And we were manipulating, let's call it the notes or the rhythm, to make each wall different, to not for its own sake, but simply that we could take a language of repetition but not make sameness. And in a sense that comes from living in Dublin, where the streets are imperfect because there is a sense of repetition of the windows, but because of the way that the Dublin was built, where you had 5 houses built beside 4 houses, built beside 3 houses, the 18th century city is imperfect. And we like that imperfection because it adds a kind of richness. Again, the sense of rotation of coming through the gateway from the entrance, through the entrance from the north-facing street into the courtyard, making an archway under the library, which bridges over this archway, connecting the garden to the entrance courtyard. And the central socializing space, which is the center of gravity for the students, and this long arm of space which reaches out to the library and to the garden. And then how this feels in the sunlight by the manipulation of these kind of piano key type fins of prefabricated concrete, and how it has a sense of a new institution arriving on this site, a new educational institution. And relating to Paris-Saclay and also to the project which I'm leading into, which is the townhouse in Kingston, is this wonderful map of St. Gall, Irish saint. And this is a 9th century map of a Benedictine monastery, one of the very earliest drawings describing the vision of the Benedictine order. And what we love about this is the nature of the drawing, but also the fact that it has, I think the idea is it has something like 300 inhabitants, but it has monks and animals and hospitals and teaching spaces, and it's a rich collective of uses. And in a time where we find that society is becoming more and more compartmentalized, it's like we're zoned into different specializations and don't benefit enough from other disciplines and other people with equal passion for what it is that they do. This thing of mixing of uses, which relates to city as well as building, as well as individual buildings. And we've learned a lot from urbanists and people who write and talk a lot about cities, people like Alejandro de Sola Morales. In a beautiful book called A Matter of Things, he describes cities and talks about needing to provoke unprecedented juxtapositions and accumulating strata, and that need for difference is a need that we have in order to make a rich society. So this represents this kind of mixture, a rich mixture of uses and inhabitants, and it's like a city in miniature, and it can also relate to a building. The townhouse in Kingston is this orange gold flag on Penryn Road, close but not visible until you move up to the 3rd or 4th floor is the Thames and Hampton Court, and it's called Penryn Road, which means promontory, which we really liked, that it has its nose facing north into the city. And the free space of this project is this long finger of space which the university made into a civic space. So it's not just the building, which is here, but it's this 200-meter length of new landscape, which becomes part of the nave or the colonnade of the 55-meter frontage onto Penryn Road. This was to be 2 or 3 different uses, primarily one noisy, one quiet, which is dance and performance, and the other being library. And we felt that this proximity was a fantastically rich thing to have, to bring these things together into one place. And we were convinced about this for a number of reasons, but just this image shows this idea of the promontory and its relationship to County Hall, Surrey County Hall, which is almost directly opposite. But the purpose of this building was also to be a welcoming space, to be porous, to not offer a barrier, to open its doors, which is a wonderful thing about library, whether it's within the university building or whether it's a public library, is that the library is the most democratic institution left in our society. And librarians are extremely democratic and open and give of their knowledge and their resources unconditionally, which is a wonderful thing to experience as an architect. So the idea was to make a civic space which would take the planting of the new landscape and bring it up through the colonnade in the form of creeping vines which are integrated into the facade. The way that the Kingston University spoke about their townhouse made us feel that it was like a warehouse of ideas, that it was that it could be this wall of columns this hall of columns where many different uses and activities could come together. And we loved this image of the Jørn Utzon showroom in Copenhagen, which was to do with an idea of walking through a hall of columns. In this case, it's a beach forest, and this little building also makes a colonnade to the sea in Copenhagen. And one of the things that is important in thinking about, say, the carpet of space that we think about as the St. Gall plan being like a kind of a tapestry of life or a tapestry of use, is how we structure space. And sometimes structuring space is very rational, but it can be quite complex in terms of the space that it generates. The plan of the structure of the townhouse in Kingston is highly rational, but it's incredibly complex in the way that a fabric is woven with the weft and the warp of the threads, that we can weave or try to weave space in terms of where light is, where it's dark, where it's bright, where it's tall, where it's low. And this is the free space of the loggia, which is given back to the town of Kingston, which wraps from the north along the west and to the south of the building. But what's really interesting is the way that a very simple, rational beginning can lead to the complexity that the building needs from that each section, let's say, changes to bring these two very different uses together into one single community. One of the things we learned from a previous project in Navan, which was a theatre and a courthouse. We decided in our wisdom to put the courthouse on top of the theatre. The idea was that it was a very constricted site and that perhaps the theatre would humanize the courts, and that there's a sense of theatre about courts, and it was this walled garden with courtyards, and the idea was that the actors in the art centre could use the court when it wasn't sitting, and perhaps the audience for the courts might drop into the art centre if they were getting out. And it's not funny really, but what we found then was that the courts pulled out. So we had very delicately designed it so that you had very specific separated circulation for judges and prisoners and defendants to get safely up to a courthouse, and made two very separate suites. And then we had to bring them together. And so we were thinking with Kingston, we should do the opposite. We should make it into one thing. So it's not two things, it's one thing. This project, we also learned about the folding floor, whether it goes with the landscape or whether we make a new landscape. And we're always mixing typologies. This is a church project by Le Corbusier, but and we go from football stadiums to churches to whatever we find our inspiration, let's say. And this is the folding floor of the theatre. But we were also, I can't pronounce this Greek word for where the Senate met in Greek. Somebody from our office printed out the phonetic description of it, but I don't have it. But what's really wonderful is that we discovered it's the same size as our central, what we call courtyard space. This project, I have to say, was also very influenced by the Half Moon Theatre by Philip Christou and the great Florian Bagel. And what we found was that the idea of making an event space feel open and feel like the heart of this townhouse, that you could, and Gerard Carty from our office loves the idea of meeting somebody in a tutu as he goes to the return desk of the library. And we thought that was a fantastic description of how you might bring these two worlds together. And when you look at the way that the plan of this building changes, it recedes in scale as it moves up, as does the project of Lima. This was partly to do with the practical requirements of light and daylight and all those regulations that you have in London, which were new to us, and so the building tapers diagonally to the more residential road. We think this was a visionary educational brief and idea to bring opposites together into one place, and also to make a building that's called a house, a townhouse for students, a home for students, that it has that sense of being intimate as well as being part of a larger group. And this is the central space, which can be used when it's empty and full, and the dance studios. The dancers can enter from above, or they can enter from behind the seating. The public foyer is open straight into this open space so that it connects, and you can also read your books and look into this space and be part of the life of the building wherever you are. The staircase is thought about as a theatrical way of moving. It's the nave, what we call the nave space, which, oh my goodness, it's time. Which connects to the long finger of landscape and brings the landscape of the building right into its interior world. And that sense of generosity, the pavement, it's close to the bus stop, it makes a social edge, and it makes a civic space. The London School of Economics, very different structure, very different set of conditions, extremely tight from an urban point of view. And I remember the first day we went to see the site, one of the engineers said to us, "How are you going to make the transfer structure?" We said, "What transfer structure?" And he said, "Well, you've got a 20-meter span in the lower level, and you've got tiny offices up above. And how do we make the transition between those two?" And we found that really interesting, that we started to think about that on the first day. How do we go from something, a big space, to a very small space? And some of the architects in our office have said, it would make a lot more sense to put the sports hall on the top of the building instead of the bottom of the building, because then you wouldn't have to make all this kind of sense of transfer. But what we found really interesting about this site is that we used the diagonal and the orthogonal in the sense of trying to, again, deal with the dynamic nature of the site, and at the same time to make it as a kind of a release between the tight streets of LSE and Lincoln's Inn Fields. We went to visit this crypt, which is the undercroft of Lincoln's Inn Chapel. We found this amazing because it has no doors. It was an open space, and the door to the chapel is on the first floor. It's not on the ground floor. So this idea of making an open space open to the city was a starting point. The transfer structure was also a starting point. We've got the big grey sports hall. We have orthogonal structure and diagonal structure. We have 3 shifts in geometry, because it's like a kind of rotating series of branches, like trees, as you move up. And it becomes this kind of space which is a real urban space open to the city. And again, the free space here is about giving back something to the city. What's fantastic about, and also really challenging about this site, is the 55-metre address onto Lincoln's Inn Fields. And one of the things that we have found in all of our projects is this wish to bring landscape through and into the building, which is to do with what Yvonne was speaking about in terms of geography and how so many people will be living in dense situations, and how can you smell a shrub or hear a bird or whatever within the density of the city. We thought about this being like a palazzo with a civic space on the ground floor, and that it would release the life of the London School of Economics into and make this connection with Lincoln's Inn Fields. We're also looking at the same idea of bringing south light through to the north in the way that we carve and use the fins as reflectors. So this wish to somehow bring a warmth to a north facade is something that we're also concerned about. Yvonne spoke about Dublin, and in the Common Ground Biennale, there was this beautiful quote that Raphael Moneo uses: "The city that accompanies you, the city you travel in and with." And this relates back to urban thinking, let's say, in relation to cities and how we make cities. This is a painting by Michael Caine of a Dublin corner, and in a way it reflects something that Elizabeth Bowen has described in speaking about Dublin, where she said that the red brick of Dublin soaks up the light in the way that a sealed orange holds the juice. And what we thought was fantastic about many of the critiques of cities is that architects don't map cities in terms of sensation or atmosphere or feeling, but that we tend to map things in a very scientific way. And again, Alejandro de Sola Morales talks about this, that we need to think about how cities, if we map them in a particular way, that we would respond to them in a particular way. I think Richard Sennett does the same thing when he talks about flesh and stone, as does Ricky Burdett when he talks about shaping cities, not planning them, but shaping them. And these urban thinkers have continually proposed this need for social mix and for richness, a rich diversity of use, which is being somehow edited out of our society. And coming to the final project in Toulouse, speaking about a city of fragments, what we found in Toulouse, which was the first building we did after, this is our building, after the Bocconi University. It's a red brick city, beautiful, picturesque city, a huge river, wonderful brick walls, wonderful churches. Sorry, I'm looking to see if the time has gone red yet. And it's in an amazing location, which is in a breach in the medieval wall. This is the university campus, the old city, which is a really tight grain, Roman city, this public space, Place Saint-Pierre, which relates directly to this new School of Economics. And while we were talking about LSE, which is full of these columns which rotate, the building in Toulouse has no columns. These look like columns, but they're fragments of wall. And this building is made completely of walls, structural walls, which are the brick walls at the edges, and then these what we call boulders of lecture theatres, which support what happens above. Apparently sorry, I'll come back to this in a moment, but this is one of the drawings this is not the actual, this is the drawing of the final design, but it's one of the drawings we did at competition stage, where we were looking at how this building could take its place in this site and this breach in the wall. And we were looking at these fragments of Toulouse going back to the wall of fragments, where we have these tiny courtyards in the middle of the old city with this slice of sky, which is the most important element of these courtyards, that the biggest window is to the sky, and these amazing buttresses which hold these and contain these spaces of the churches. And we were trying to find ways where we could make buttresses and colonnades and courtyards which would be like a collage of fragments of things that we found. And the plan of the city as a kind of a broken heart, which very different to the Milan project that we had just finished. And the builders apparently called this building the Butterfly. And we thought that was really interesting because in the basement, lower ground level, it's a perimeter plan, let's say, which has this wall which wraps around and contains space. And then it's carved out in the middle, and then it's carved out again, and then it's carved out again, and then it finds its full form at the top level, and it's connected with this cloister which makes the slice of sky, which is the entrance courtyard. And again, you see, a bit like Kingston, you see that the plan and the working of the section are quite different things, in a sense that perhaps one sees the sculpting more in this plan than one might in the other plans. But it's something we really try to do, is to work with the space, the spaces we're dealing with. You see the buttress walls, which are actually the fire escapes, the folding wall, which are working environmentally, as is the building in Paris-Saclay, the kind of knot of space, which is the centering point around which all of the rest of the university moves, and it really makes this focal point. And then the connection to the city, that you're standing and you're part of the city. Again, in terms of climate, the public space is protected from wind and rain, but it's outside. So you have these students standing where they can almost touch the dome of the church, or you're standing on a bridge and you're looking down to the entrance ramp, and then you see the sense of how it sits in this folding, rotating butterfly building, which takes up its shape in the breach in the medieval wall. And we make the secure line which is needed, but we also connect the city into the heart of the building. I'm going to finish very quickly with the flying island of Laputa. Yvonne wasn't sure if I should show this, but I think it's kind of fun because, well, first of all, we looked at this when we were doing the, our city architect might not like to know, when we were doing the competition for the Dublin City Library, because we loved this idea of the floating gardens. It's relevant because it was written 1747 or something. It's Gulliver's Travels. I don't know if you've all read it. But what was fantastic is that Swift was imagining, going back to Yvonne's beginning, Swift was imagining a floating world where I have to check what it was used. It floats by virtue of magnetic levitation, which the inhabitants knew perfectly how to maneuver. It had a cave full of water. The inhabitants were interested in astrology. They spent their time listening to the music of the spheres, but they were continually worried that the sun would go out. And there was something kind of interesting about that, just thinking about where we are now and how we imagine ourselves optimistically with all of the potential that architecture inherently has to make new worlds and to make new futures. Thank you. 6 minutes for questions.
Thank you very much, Yvonne and Shelley. I've been to a fair few Grafton gigs, but I think that one was pretty special. According to the timer, we have -5 minutes for questions. I have a whole sheet full, but I think it's probably best if we go straight to the audience. If there are pithy questions, to which we will seek terse replies. So if I can ask, if you're going to ask a question, you can first of all use the microphone. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, hello. You've explained quite nicely how you get inspiration from different buildings that are very different to what you're designing, a church or a stadium or a different function. And also, I was very interested, you talked about your sort of inspiration from the Ospedale Maggiore in Milan, from your project near Paris, which obviously that was a hospital, a teaching hospital perhaps, and is now a university, which is similar to your project in Paris. My question is, do you see your buildings being something else in 200 or 300 years, say one of university being a hospital or a housing building? I think would be amazing, say in your Lima building, being living in there and having these sight lines and being walking in this bridge and meeting my neighbors, or how do you see that happening in the future or possible?
Actually, some architect colleagues, when we were showing Lima in the 2016, no, which one?
12?
The Alejandro Aravena Biennale. 2016. And we showed that project, and some Belgian colleagues came in and they looked at it and said, "My God, what is it? And is it finished?" And we said, "It's a university." And they said, "Yeah, right, okay, but it could be housing. It could be housing, or it could be housing and a university." And that was really interesting comment. But buildings do that all the time. They change use. But the Smithsons said something really interesting, that the most flexible structure, the most flexible building is the one that's most specific. Not neutral, but specific. And I think that's also very interesting, that and when we were being interviewed for the Bocconi building, one of the people on the jury was, it's funny coincidence, was Henri Siriani from Lima. And we said something about flexibility, and he said flexibility is lousy. And we've always been worried about using that word. I think organic or open-ended or loose or whatever. But flexibility suggests neutrality. But that thing and it's also a question now of reuse, because we're delighted to be working with Dublin Port on the reuse of industrial buildings. And that's fantastic, that you can imagine new uses for spaces that you couldn't possibly design for those uses, but they're there. And I think architecture has that capacity.
Could I add to that question about buildings when they exist, and also things that are deep in people's unconscious? When we lived here in London, Niamh Brown had just finished Alexander Road, and what's amazing about that project is that it's a kilometre long of stadium in which it was a kind of a thesis on the terraced house, and it becomes a place on a railroad with kind of rubber to take the impact of the railway going through. And what happens sometimes is that you have physically absorbed existing buildings, and then another opportunity arrives in the future for that to be translated. So the Lima building, if you like, could have been in our unconscious of a translation from Stadia or Niamh Brown's building here just down in Camden. And it's very interesting to watch. One of the things that's amazing about Ospedale Maggiore is that it's from the 1400s, I think, I'm really sure, that sustainability, when people talk about sustainability, and you kind of clip on a few, solar panels and you kind of make that's one way of thinking of it. But when you make spaces and organizations and simple, the section of you, when we looked at the section, the way of dealing with going back to the President's point about drainage, just even the way that building has been thought about from the 1400s in terms of it as a hospital. And a very interesting point of when Thomas Jefferson was in Europe, there were competitions on hospitals, and he was really learning about the deep plan and the changing air. And then he goes back to the United States and he does an incredibly beautiful building, essentially a campus, but it's influenced by thinking about hospitals in Europe. So the cross-fertilization, not only physical buildings being transformed, but also ideas, lasting generations and being handed around. And it's the fact that Ospedale Maggiore, when Milan has its, special weeks, it's full of life still. That's its strength. It survives.
I might just, I was struck in your talk about this by any number of things, but particularly this line about in Beethoven, he doesn't try to hide the struggle. And I suppose I was thinking about the struggle of getting buildings made, which is long and arduous and very, very complex. And yet there is this kind of sense of directness, it feels like, between something of the original impulse of the project and what we see. How do you hold that line or that trajectory? Or do you? Or is it something that's constantly shifting?
It's very interesting looking at the boards, the competition boards for the townhouse, and the townhouse that's just finished in Kingston, and that the only changes that have happened have enriched the project, and that was to do with the client, the fact that the clients kept the group of the competition judges to kind of review it as it went along, which is very unusual. And then with the planning system, that trying to find that soft tissue between location and place and building, that all those things enrich a building. They don't necessarily damage a building, and that then you get contractors. We were struck yesterday just being on site in the LSE, and you realize that there are clients, there are ideas, and then the workmen. And then there's somebody whose name you never know, who's worked really hard on that junction, on making that. And that it is an incredibly collaborative effort from idea to have a project to the making. And you need all the stars aligned. You need good contractors with decent work people on board. You need the clients to hold it together. It's an incredibly complex profession to get an idea to reality.
And I think we should say that when we're building buildings, we talk about it being like the accident and emergency ward in our office, those people in charge, because they work day and night to keep control of this, because you're always on call. Yeah. And it's that collaboration. That's why we asked that this award go to Grafton Architects, because that is our team, that is us, and that's the way we hold on to the sketch and the building at the end.
I think that image of the A&E ward somewhere in College Green, 40 people or so crammed into an A&E ward, constantly keeping projects going, feels like a good place, and maybe to draw to a close. I must say, among the many pleasures of seeing you both speak and watching the wonderful work literally unfold in glorious widescreen, and particularly, I would say, the plans were, yes, the sections, but actually the plans, the well-tempered plans, were really, really striking. And it's great to see, and it's handy in a way that you've got a whole number of buildings finishing in the last few months that you can show us this evening. I know that there's a reception probably already started upstairs, so it just ask you to join me in once again thanking Shelley and Yvonne for an absolutely wonderful